Hello to everyone. I'm Craig Davis, Director of Adult Services for Chicago Public Library, and pleased to welcome you to this program presented in celebration of the 20th anniversary of the One Book, One Chicago initiative. One Book, One Chicago launched in fall 2001 as an opportunity to engage and enlighten Chicago residents and to foster a sense of community through reading. With generous support from the Chicago Public Library Foundation, Chicago Public Library and its community partners offer an annual season of learning and engagement focusing not just on one book, but on one theme integral to the lives of all Chicagoans. As we like to say, the book is just the beginning. And today, we look back at the spring 2005 One Book selection, The Oxbow Incident, by Walter Van Tilburg Clark. This neglected classic Western is a powerful novel that grapples with universal questions of justice and morality. Ideas around these topics couldn't be more pertinent today than they were in 1940 when the book was first published. When we announced the selection of the Oxbow Incident as the One Book, One Chicago choice back in 2005, we had the opportunity to welcome Joyce Miller Bean to deliver a talk about the book to Chicago Public Library librarians to help inspire them as they engaged in the delivery of one book programming. For those of us who were present at Joyce's talk, it left an indelible impression. Her passion for this book, combined with her skills as a storyteller, entranced the audience. I was privileged to be there, and it is a highlight from my memories of one book programming. And now a bit about today's speaker. Joyce Miller Bean was an English instructor at DePaul University and taught their One Book, One Chicago class for several One Book, One Chicago selections, including the Oxbow Incident. And I would just like to say that DePaul has been a longtime partner and continues to be a significant partner in the One Book initiative. Joyce has been a professional storyteller for over 30 years, has twice been the official storyteller for the Illinois State Library at the Illinois State Fair, as well as having been one of the storytellers in a PBS television series called Story Barn. She has done multicultural storytelling for multiple branches of the Chicago Public Library, as well as stories at Chicago Public Schools, private schools, varied houses of worship, and private parties and gatherings. And personally, I highly recommend her for any of those. Joyce's storytelling repertoire includes classic tales from Aesop to Shakespeare, many types of ethnic folklore, and more. She does stories for adults as well as children. Joyce's specialty is ghost stories, from bone-chilling narratives for adults to age-appropriate ghostly tales for young people. And now, please join me in welcoming Joyce Miller Bean, who will discuss Walter Van Tilburg Clark's The Oxbow Incident.
Thank you, Craig, and welcome everyone. I'm not only happy to be able to discuss this powerful novel and its timely themes, I'm indeed as happy to be here as Craig was polite enough and kind enough to say he and the library were happy to have me. When I was an undergraduate student, I read an article about T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. The article dealt with Lawrence's death. Apparently, he was on a motorcycle on the right. He had the right of way, and he was doing a normal speed, not particularly fast. But unfortunately, a couple on bicycles came around the curve just as Lawrence was heading their way. And he had a split second to decide if he was going to turn off and let them, despite them being in the wrong, move forward on the road. But in turning off, his motorcycle would fall into a gully to the right of the road. Well, Lawrence made that choice. He turned off, the couple was fine. He fell into the gully and he died. The reason this is relevant to my opening a discussion on the Oxbow incident is that I never forgot that article as a young person. After Lawrence's death, they found in journals that he had kept as a young man before he really began his career, in which Lawrence had decided if ever there was a time when his life had to be, when he had to decide whether he would put his life above those of others in what he considered to be a moral situation, i.e., am I more important than others in this? He said, I would not put my life first. Now, while most of us hopefully won't encounter those kinds of literal life and death choices, the thing that I think what Lauren said there and what Walter Van Tilburg Clark is telling us in the Oxbow incident is, whether you like it or not, people, somewhere, sometime in your life, you're going to have to make a moral decision. Am I going to do what my conscience dictates, or am I going to do what the crowd tells me, or what my fears dictate? It may not be something, as I said, as great as hopefully a life or death decision as T.E. Lawrence faced. But what about when you're in a group, a party, at work, and you hear a colleague or even a stranger involved with it making a racial slur, or a homophobic slur, or an anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, any number of the horrible things that we know, most of us know and accept are bad? Are you going to say something? Or are you going to be afraid and think, I don't want to get in trouble? Is it enough to say, well, I'm not joining in, so I guess that makes me, not culpable in this? Or are you going to say, hey, look, whatever your feelings, that's wrong? I very much believe that's what part of the power of the Oxbow incident. While the novel reflects the events of one terrible circumstance, a lynching, it nonetheless, in its individual study of characters and what I'm about to get into in a bit more depth, I believe poses the question, the powerful question that all good literature wants us to ask ourselves: how will this affect me in real life? And I believe that the whole novel supports this. What will you do when you're called upon to answer to your conscience or your fears? The basic elements, I want to use this to show the power of this novel and the power of what it does to what I would argue its argument of conscience. So the basic breakdown, of course, setting, characters, plot, conflict, and resolution. So let's start talking, let's begin a discussion of the setting. Van Tilburg Clark, if you read any of the biographical information about him, was very, very concerned that his writing would really reflect what people's dialogues authentically, how we interact genuinely. But I would argue that as excellent as the Oxbow incident does in that regard, succeed in my opinion, I would argue he uses his settings in a way that's very effective, both for the novel and to make us think. For example, his descriptions of the surrounding, of the weather and the effects of the elements on the psyches of the men and women involved in this lynching leads the novel and the reader in a powerful direction, in my opinion. I would argue that it begins with a marvelous description of nature, the elements. And at the beginning of the novel, despite the men having emerged from this, it's beautiful. Spring is there. And when we get to the very end of the novel, despite the horrors of what has happened in the interim, in the development of the plot, the story, it ends with a meadowlark singing. I just want to share just a portion of this to begin to show. I would argue Van Tilburg Clark is showing us that nature encases us with opportunities to be at peace, to accept, to enjoy the beauty around us. But in between the opening beauty of the spring and the closing beauty of the sound of a meadowlark, much damage is done. But nonetheless, we get chance after chance to renew, like the spring, like the beauty of nature, like this passage, which is on page 3 and 4 of the novel in my version. In the pockets, under the red earth banks, where the wind was cut off, the spring sun was as hot as summer, and the air was full of a hot, melting pine smell. Rivulets of water trickled down, shining on the sides of the cut. The jays screeched in the trees and flashed through the sunlight in the clearings in swift, long dips. Squirrels and chipmunks chittered in the brush and along the tops of the snow-sodden logs. The snow-sodden logs Spring is back. There's life, there's beauty, there's energy. Why couldn't we all, Gil, Croft, the men and women that they're going to meet in town, the three men, the innocent men who would be accused of rustling, why can't we all have just lived and enjoyed? But that is the nature. Also, throughout the novel, I would argue that Van Tilburg Clark uses what is described in literary studies as the pathetic fallacy. In a nutshell, the pathetic fallacy maintains that we humans think nature reflects what's involved in our hearts and our emotions. So for example, if you're having a wonderful day and the sun comes out, we tend to think that's not just the sun coming out. No. Bicarbonate of soda, that's because I'm happy. In reality, the philosophers say, well, perhaps there is an influence, perhaps not. But what Van Tilburg Clark does in this is that if you'll notice, storms, I would argue, are the basic metaphor for what's building up in the human hearts of the men and women involved in the lynch mob as well. We see a gentle upslope, a storm is coming. Snow becomes blinding. They're blinded on their travels to Oxbow, where they will encounter the men they're going to lynch. The storm does come, and then it passes, but it leaves damage in its wake. This is what happens in the events of the Oxbow incident, and I don't think it's a coincidence that Van Tilburg Clark used the storm to indicate what was happening. The dialogue, if Van Tilburg Clark were alive today, sadly he died in 1971 of cancer. If he were alive today, I would say, yes, as a reader, I have to tell you, you definitely accomplished bringing me into it in realistic dialogue. I felt that I was riding along with those men and women in the lynch mob. I felt the feel of the hide of the horses' bodies underneath me, the slush of their hoofs as they went through the snow. It's a remarkable accomplishment. And in their talk with each other, it's a remarkable sense of I was in it. Not that I would have wanted to be, but as if I were a camera riding along. That is powerful writing. And it also makes me as a reader really, really feel that the effect that I feel Van Tilburg Clark wanted us to feel. But let's talk about the characters. The characters as well are what make the plot in this book. As you probably know, some stories, some novels are plot motivated, move forward. Others, characters do it. Of course, in this case, I would argue that it's a complete parallel. The two are interconnected. It's better than parallel. There are a lot of characters in the Oxbow incident, but interestingly enough, I don't think it's hard to keep track of them because Van Tilburg Clark gives us such distinct personalities. And here's where the real heart of what I would argue is his message comes across. What was the real reason, the motivation, the genuine, authentic motivation for the folks joining this lynch mob? As we'll see as we discuss some of the major characters, it's not just the anger of rustling. So what have you got built up here? You've got all these men and women that have been intensely kept in from the harsh winter. They're coming out. The buildup is remarkable in all of them. The anger, the frustration, there's sexual tension. This is a town full of primarily men, and there are very few women, since in terms of there's sexual frustration, men and women been together. That is, and it's all built up. So let's talk about what were the real reasons beyond cattle rustling, as heinous as that was to the people at that time. Let's talk some of the characters. Of course, Art Croft and Gil Carter, Art and Croft as they called him, and Gil are kind of our main characters, actually, I would argue, with Croft being the narrator. I think they represent all of us. Both seem to be good men, decent fellas with their flaws. Gil has the temper on him. The poker scene, I'm going to interconnect plot with characters. I'm not going to separate them. So I'm not going to do that as a distinct and separate thing. So look at the poker scene that opens the novel. What do we see there? Gil is raring, he's angry. Rose Mapin, the woman he loves, or at least was attracted to, has disappeared and didn't return his affection. So he's testy. He really is close friends with Croft, but by God, they've been locked up in this cabin. They can't take it. So he gets drunk from his frustrations with Rose. He plays in the poker game. And what do we see? We see that although Gil loves a fight, he's nonetheless a decent guy because he wins honestly. But when Farnley, make sure I'm pronouncing his name, yeah, Farnley, another character who will be pivotal in organizing the lynching, when he thinks that he's been cheated and he and Gil get into a fight, and Gil beats the tar out of him actually, when Gil comes to, he realizes that he wants to give back $10, which was, of course, a lot more money at that time. This shows us his character. Croft is kind of not only the narrator, but the voice of conscience. I find it interesting that Croft doesn't want that role. He just wants to be a good cowpoke, a good friend, do whatever, earn some money. But he finds himself pulled into events that he didn't want to be a part of, but which pulled him in nonetheless. This is why I would argue what the first thing that Van Tilburg Clark is saying to us as readers is, look, folks, Gil and Croft are most of us. We're not perfect. We're not evil. And we'd like to stay, on the sidelines with these negative things. Life's not going to let you do it. So that's their motivation, is one might argue, for being involved in the lynch mob, is they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were just out pouring water over Gil's head to bring him to after Canby, the bartender, had to slap him on the head with a bottle to stop him in the fight. And as they're doing it, they hear young Green on his horse, the young man who's going to say, Kincaid's been killed. Oh my God, Kincaid's been killed and cattle have been stolen. That begins the plunge. Now, the other motivations, that's like the small, the candle, the match that lights the fuse. And the fuse is slowly snaking its way towards the bomb. And the bomb that will explode is the tragedy of lynching 3 innocent men. So then we have, among major characters, Farnley, a young guy who's not really evil, but very hot-headed, I would argue. He was best friends with Kincaid. And when young Green tells them that Kincaid was shot dead in cold blood, he sees red. Farnley's like, that's it. Well, we got to go find this. The rustlers, they murdered my friend. And if you folks won't join me, i.e., if you're cowards, I'll go it alone. That puts in motion what all of us have. Then all right, am I afraid to do what's right? Is it right to go after these men? What is it? He has, one could argue, I would say, at least a righteous, that's the wrong word probably, he would feel righteous reason for his ire, i.e. one of his best friends was killed, and these men committed the ultimate crime in that time in the West, cattle rustling. But what about the others? There's Osgood, the town drunk and blowhard, who's obviously, you do not have to be the sweetheart of Sigmund Freud to figure out that this guy has psychological issues with self-esteem. A drunk who lives off of the lawgrass of leftover drinks of others, but get a few whiskeys into him and then he's the toughest thing out there. Osgood, one could argue, not only added to that fuse that's going to the bomb, that's going to lead to the lynching, he blew on it to make it, gave it more, added little bits of twigs and grass to make it flare up and go faster. No, we got to get him. What are you, a bunch of cowards? And then again, the hackles rise on these. Remember, the majority of the people involved in this lynch mob are tough men. They're out there, they face the elements, they go it alone, and they're tough people. And to challenge what they would call their manhood, oh, no. So Smith is actually the town drunk, the town blowhard. He blows on the fuse that is the bomb that will lead to this lynching. There are a lot of side characters, but I would argue the remaining top ones are, of course, Davies. Davies is the voice of conscience. Davies is that voice within all of us that knows better. Davies is the voice that when you were a kid told you, you said, no, Dad and Mom said, don't eat cookies before dinner. I just want one. It's innocent then. Davies was the man. He represents, when we go back to the example I gave about listening to a person somewhere, a colleague doing slurs against one type of individual or group, and should I say something? Should I get involved? He's the one that would say, yeah, we should say something, do something. While he isn't perfect in it, as is evidenced by his own sense of guilt that racks him at the end of the novel when he has not been able to stop the lynching. The question that he tries throughout, he's the one who, as you know, from the novel from the first time they're saying there's a lynch mob, he says, no, let's get Judge Tyler, let's get Sheriff Risley in there. We can't just go in and get these men and kill them. They need a trial. But the blood is boiling. All the things that Van Tilburg Clark has shown us is built up, the weather, the tension, it's all no. They have to hit something. They have to do something. And this is a righteous and a legitimate reason. One of our own has been murdered and cattle have been stolen. We will get them. Davies is saying, but is there a murder? What do we know about the circumstances about things? And no one will listen. He tries and tries and tries. But by the end of the novel, he is convinced. In the final scene, when he's in talking to young Croft, he says, did I? He admits to himself, and this is where I think Van Tilburg Clark asks us as readers to decide, do you agree with Davies about his self-assessment or do you not? Everyone else, including Croft, says, what have you got to feel guilty about? You tried to stop us. You came along with the lynch mob without a gun just so you could reason with us. But Davies, in a strong sense, I would argue, element of self-honesty, says, did I? I deliberately didn't bring a gun because then I knew I wouldn't be forced to use it. He said, I knew, he said, in my heart, I should have brought a gun. I could have then held it onto Major Tetley, whom we'll get to in a moment, and stopped this, forced us to the group. If I had done that, he said, if I had stopped Tetley, then the mob would have been stopped. We would have brought them back to justice, and this wouldn't have happened. But I didn't have the guts to do that. So this is, again, where I think the author asks us as readers to say, are we culpable if we have done something but not enough? What is enough? And that doesn't mean every single element of our life we'll have to go into these kind of detailed analyses of ourselves. But this is important as we develop as humans. Major Tetley. There's always a Major Tetley on the scene. The one that knows better than all of us. You folks know what I'm talking about. In every social group, in every office setting, in every family, there's a Major Tetley. No. You people don't know what to do. Excuse me. I'll step in. I know how to handle it. I know the best way to make a strawberry daiquiri. What you're doing is nothing. I don't care. You were a bartender for 35 years. I read a book. I know what's the best curriculum for our children in this school. The PTA meetings, don't tell me. They are headstrong and they have their own motivations. Often, as Van Tilburg Clark, I think, is showing us intently, nothing to do with the situation at hand. It was obvious. Again, you did not have to be a psychiatrist to know that Tetley was angry. He had been a Confederate general. He had been on the losing side. That rankled him. He had a son, Gerald, who was, to his mind, a weak waste of skin. To the rest of us, Gerald Tetley was obviously an abuse victim, but also a decent young man who was trying to find the right way to live his life, which is, again, what I would argue Van Tilburg Clark is asking us. What's the right way to live your life? And instead of getting the time and space to develop, because he is young, he's in his early 20s, is my impression. His father is, no, you're a coward, you're nothing. He forces him along to join the lynch mob. Gerald warns him, he says, if you force me to do this, I'll kill myself. And his father does just that, forces him to knock one of the horses out from one of the innocent men. So Tetley is a villain. The reason I would argue that this novel is such a classic is that Van Tilburg Clark doesn't give us any two-dimensional people. The man is a beast, and Davies describes him as such. And at first, when he's told about the suicide of his sweet son, who couldn't take having been a part of this and hangs himself, it's almost as if he doesn't care. Thank you for the news. But then we find out he threw himself on his sword. He committed suicide, but in a way he felt, a pathetic, shallow way of what he would argue showed honor. So Tetley was the monster indeed that Davies described. He's the beast that egged this on. Those men would be alive if Tetley hadn't forced everyone's hand. But he was trying, he wasn't even interested in justice. He was interested in proving something to himself, that he had not sired a weak son. And by God, he was going to make this boy man up, whatever that means. So again, there's a touch of, I would argue, Van Tilburg Clark is saying there's a touch of Tetley in all of us. Who among us doesn't at times want to be the one to say, oh, the rest of you are a little silly. I know what I'm doing here. Sometimes we're right. Sometimes we're wrong. But it has its consequences. And we should at least, like Davies tried, I think Van Tilburg Clark is arguing, at least try to analyze, why did I really do this? Was I really interested in justice about the murder of a man whom we later find out Kincaid wasn't even murdered and the cattle were not even stolen? But am I interested in getting justice for these crimes? Or am I interested in proving something to myself and others? Tetley's a monster, but there's a bit of the beast in all of us, I would argue Van Tilburg Clark is saying. And the various other characters, then I'd like to just briefly focus on the marginalized characters in this novel, because that to me is a fascinating examination. Now, remembering, as Craig pointed out, this book was written in 1940. So many of the negative stereotypical names for people of color, attitudes towards women were very commonplace. Now, I'm Afro-Indigenous, African-American and Native American of the Muskogee Creek Nation. So I was on the receiving end of many of the mob's ideas of negative about people of color. We have, for example, of course, there is first Sparks. Sparks is an almost saintly figure. But once again, I like that Van Tilburg Clark does not make his African-American character a two-dimensional cardboard saint. What he has is a man who is motivated. He does refer to Sparks as the men in the lynch mob and refer to them by the N-word. But for Van Tilburg Clark to have written any other term to describe him would have been unrealistic. I mean, these men would not have said, oh yeah, the nice colored fellow that we're bringing along with us. But what is Sparks? I would argue, I don't know, and I researched it, but I have not been able to find out what Van Tilburg Clark's socio-political views were. Was he a liberal? Was he more of a conservative person? Because what he does in a couple of scenes there with Sparks, to me as a person of color who's keenly aware of this, showed that he was imbuing Sparks with a form of dignity that went against the common grain of what was usually done to characters of color, both in novels, films, television shows at the era. Well, 1940 TV wasn't as much of a thing, but movies, books, usually a ongoing sense of infantilizing. You know, we were never particularly African-American characters. We were just never that bright and well-meaning and almost like humanoid puppy dogs, you know. But Sparks has dignity throughout, even when there are attempts to make him undignified. He was a minister, whether ordained or not. They call him sarcastically Reverend most of the time, but he just does what he believes in. He goes along with this lynch mob, the only African-American. There are two Latino characters, but African-American there. And that took some doing. He was on a lynch mob. And when he and Croft, and this is where I love what Van Tilburg Clark does, I would argue, to give real dignity to Sparks. Sparks is forced to ride without a saddle. He doesn't have a coat. He's so anxious to go along with this to see if he can help justice be done somehow. He knows that as a Black man, they're not going to listen to him. But the courage that the man shows in going along to see if he can try. And when he and Croft get into discussion on the journey, and Croft finds out that as a 7-year-old, Sparks saw the lynching of his own brother, and that it's clear that he wants to never have anything such as that happen again on his watch. Croft does an unusual thing for a white man at that time to a Black man. He offers and then insists that the shivering Sparks take his coat. Sparks first turns it down with gratitude. He says no. And then he calls him, please, Reverend, take my coat. And when Croft does that, he's calling him Reverend with dignity, with the true meaning of the term. And Sparks does take the coat, and he only returns it when Croft is later shot. But this is an important, to me, statement. That's why I was curious of Van Tilburg Clark's open-mindedness. White characters did not do that for Black characters. Even if they wanted to do it quietly because they liked the Black character, they did it where others couldn't see. Clearly, everyone would have seen that that was Croft's coat, and he didn't care. That's an interesting spark of humanity and dignity that shows that these are not a group of people, that this mob is not composed of people that are all monsters and vindictively stupid, like the drunk or Monty Smith or any of that, that it's people, human people. Croft was moved. Race didn't matter. Age difference didn't matter. Sparks is much older than him. He saw, my God, this is a man who watched this and he's trying not to do it again, see it happen again. I respect that. Other marginalized characters, the Latino characters, Amigo, a stereotypic name for a Mexican character, is he's not given, he's considered by the mob a step above Sparks as the Black man, but not much. He's still considered kind of almost comic relief. Amigo, how many did you see? What valley did you see him in? His character speaks in kind of a pidgin English, which is realistic if the man has not been in, I don't know how long he'd been a cow wrangler as opposed to while living in Mexico, growing up apparently in Mexico. So maybe the fact that, of course, Spanish was his primary language. But his character is not treated with dignity in its way, weird way, the way Sparks is, but neither, and this is where I'm interested too, in Van Tilburg Clark's mindset, neither is he made into a complete stereotype. The slouching, sombrero wearing, in fact, a lot of them wear sombreros, which was realistic, I would imagine, in the weather at the time. But like, not a heavy accent, which is nothing wrong with having an accent. But, I don't understand senor type stereotypic nonsense that so often happened in novels and movies. And then, of course, the other Latino character is the one they call the Mex, who is one of the three, quote, rustlers. While he did not kill Kincaid, nor were those particular cattle rustled, it's interesting. They made his character not exactly a clean guy. He had some shady dealings in his past, but he did not deserve this. And I like that about Van Tilburg Clark too. You don't have to be perfect to deserve not to be lynched. The fact that young Martin, who is lynched, and the older gentleman, Hardwick, who was the feeble-minded gentleman, whom obviously we would know now was the war had PTSD had affected him greatly. While they were more completely innocent, young Martin, of course, it's heartbreakingly innocent. Oh my gosh. A loving young man. I'll get to him in a minute. But the Mexican character who was with them, so his life wasn't perfect. He didn't murder a man and he didn't steal the cattle and he certainly didn't deserve to be lynched. And I also love the humanity that this could be any of us too. No, none of us is perfect. None of us, if we want to be honest. The man or woman who tells me I'm not a liar has lied right there. So none of us have that. And he showed extraordinary bravery in facing, he knew they were going to kill him. When he got shot in the leg trying to escape, he, as you dug the bullet out himself with a knife. Although young Gerald had tried to help and couldn't do it, he became sort of sickened by the blood. His father was disgusted. But even so, after all that, he made a confession, interestingly enough, to the only other Catholic, I assume, character there, Amigo. And Amigo wanted him to stop. Whatever he said in confession, that Amigo was then tasked with sharing that with a priest when he could. He knew they were innocent, and something about that made him think it. But they wouldn't listen to stop the lynching. But at the end, as the rope is around the man they called the Mex's neck, as the horse is unsettled and about to be pulled out from under him, he panics. He's human. For him to have stoically sat there and said, fine, I don't think would have been human. He was a brave guy. He was a brave man who was flawed. He didn't deserve to be murdered. And when it realized that his life was going to be snuffed out that way for no reason, he was afraid. Does that make his character cowardly all through it and just showed at the end? No. Van Tilburg Clark, again, masterfully, in my opinion, shows these are human beings. And the older gentleman was obviously, his mind had been broken by the war. He was terrified. He would have said anything. He would have said up was down to stay alive. To murder him was just a travesty beyond the travesty that was happening. And then young Martin. This is what I love too. Van Tilburg Clark balances pathos and poignancy, sometimes with humor, but mainly the heart. I would argue young Martin is the heart of this novel because he was completely innocent. He didn't have a bill of sale to prove the cattle had been purchased because he trusted Drew, the big land cattle owner. He didn't know that the had stolen things in the past or done bad things. He just knew would help him on this drive. He knew, along with that gentleman, that the gun, Kincaid's gun, had been found by the side of the road. And interestingly enough, the man called the Mex was trying to really give it back, but that looked like was damning against them. And his tears that the men mocked, they were the cowards, but by doing this, but his tears were the tears of any human being facing such an unfair situation, but particularly one he had a wife and young children. He said, no one will take care of them. The youngest is just a baby. And his writing that heartbreaking letter that Davies mistakenly, but innocently, but well-meaningly tried to share with the others to see if he could stop it. It's whatever was in it had to be just profoundly moving. And then when I remember the first time I read the novel, when it described how, because young Gerald couldn't move the horse out smartly under him, he suffered the most painful. The other two died instantly, but he choked. They had to shoot him, and he had done nothing but try to provide for the wife he loved and the children he adored. And the thing that's so well written about it, Van Tilburg Clark doesn't make him maudlin or a perfect saint, just a young man who wanted the life that he deserved to live. Powerful, because you can never undo it. I think that Van Tilburg Clark wants us as readers to remember, you can never undo it. When you've done certain things we can say, I'm sorry. I said a bad thing about you behind your back. I'm sorry. I shoplifted that pound of coffee because I was low on money. I'm going to pay the fine. I'm sorry. But other things, and not just deaths, as in this case, the thing you say that stabs someone to the heart, the lie you tell someone's employer so you can get that job over them, these things too cannot really ever be undone. There's Ma Greer, an interesting character, tries to be as tough as the men, owns a boarding house, brings in money, has her own herds, but she's still limited unfairly by the unspoken and spoken code of the times that no matter how tough, no matter how capable in terms of handling your money, you're a woman. And the only way that she thinks she can achieve equality with the men, and which she sorely craves, is to put herself boldly in front of them. Ma Greer is one of the ones, no, hang him, we gotta go. She knocks one of the horses out from one of the innocent men. But but the men take her only so seriously. That's because of her age. She's given a little more credence. And notice she always has to use humor to try and wheedle them around. She even has to tolerate that foul, drunken Smith making sexual / romantic advances to her. And they only have one scene when they're all sitting around the campfire before he's putting his hand around her and trying to basically, as the kids would say today, come on to her. I kind of lost my lunch there. But the reality is she was not any more capable of fitting into the male dynamic that she wanted to be considered an equal part of than Rose Mapen, who uses her beauty, her sexuality to control the men in her life as she thinks control. But she doesn't. She marries a man she obviously doesn't care that much about, but he's rich. She can think she can control him. Again, women were powerless and tried to achieve power in whatever way, which is human, that they could. The other, I would argue, as a group of marginalized are the wives and mothers. We see them at the beginning when they're trying to talk their men out of going, several of them try to talk the men out of going on in the lynch mob. They bring the children to see them, but we don't even have names. The men shake their heads. No, God, do it. This is men's work. Get back in the house. Take care of the kids. Take care of the home. This is women's work. But they're crying. They're saying, this will affect us. They will be just as affected, they feared, as poor Martin's wife was. when the news would finally reach her about what happened. So what do we have all together in the conflict is obviously, will we do it? They did. And the shock and horror as we come to the resolution of the novel, what a horror to find. Not only is Kincaid alive, the man they were supposedly avenging, the cattle were honestly sold, not stolen. The man who sold them to them is there with the cash that the poor young Martin had given him still in his pocket. What kind of and after all of that has been said and done, there's suicide, guilt, and grief. But is there redemption? Mostly we hope after something this horrific there'd be redemption. But I think Van Tilburg Clark asks us, doesn't answer that for us. We have to decide as readers and as human beings. Does it, the sheer horror of finding that not only that the supposed causes didn't exist, the men who could have stopped it were a mere, they run into them, what, an hour, half an hour after they've hanged these innocent men? There's the judge, there's Sheriff Risley to say, no, no. So what are we left with? Resolution. We see two suicides. Young Gerald follows through, he tries twice, second time he succeeds. He can't face life having done this. His father, supposedly so tough and vicious, throws himself on his own sword. The guilt that Davies honestly expresses is beating in the hearts of many of the men. Some of the younger ones perhaps will think I was on the edges, it didn't affect me, but I would argue that by the time they're certainly my age, thoughts will come back to them. They'll have children, they'll have things, a lifetime of experiences, but they'll never forget what they didn't do on this one, I would argue. Is there redemption? I'm not sure. Of the one person we felt probably should have felt okay, Davies points out, no, I was flawed. I should have done more. One of the small humorous things he does, I do love how when young Croft is listening to Davies' confessions, he's like, we hear his inner monologue, like, why is everybody telling me? Why am I father confessor? But Davies is seeking redemption. They all are. And I think Van Tilburg Clark leaves it an open point as to whether those of us involved, whatever we do in our life, whatever decisions we make, the redemption will or will not be there because of us. And I think that's the closing thought. He ends with the serenity of nature, but I think he ends the novel with it, doesn't have to be directly said, but this question for us all, which is why I would argue it is so powerful and still worth read. What would you have done if you had been in that lynch mob, or when you face whatever moral dilemmas will come to you in this life? What would you have done then? And what will you do now? Thank you. That's my take on the Oxbow incident.
Thank you, Joyce. That was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I have a few questions that I and my colleagues have prepared. Personally, I have always thought that this book's narrative proceeds very slowly at first, and then begins to build tension in an ever-increasing manner to its shattering conclusion. It seems to slowly reach a crescendo when we hit that conclusion. What would you say to those who start reading and might have a hard time getting through the first half of the book that would encourage them to keep reading?
That is an excellent question, Craig. I would agree with it, first of all, your assessment. There is a purpose to it. I would argue that the small scenes that build the tension, the everything from the weather to the poker game to the anger and sexual tension between what happened with Rose Mapin and Gil, to all of these things, the fights, are all what you might call tiny fires building up that are all going to lead towards the great conflagration that is the lynching. They all egged it on. You have to understand those small fires in the personal psyches, actions, and souls of each of the characters, or you won't understand why the conflagration, i.e. the actual lynching, takes place. what we have to learn about Ma Greer to know why, as a woman, she was there, why she had the viewpoint she did. What we have to learn about Farnley through the poker game that shows us he's a hothead and he regrets it, but he's not a bad guy. All that's necessary. If I can share another example that shows that sometimes it's it with books. I'm a ghost story lover, and as such, in contemporary novels, who is the master today? Stephen King. But who did Stephen King look up to? And he's still alive, still looks up to? Peter Straub. Stephen King has often said that the ghost story writer, Peter Straub, with whom he later collaborated on The Talisman, was one of his heroes. Now, back when I was relatively newly married, my son was a baby, so it was like in '79. Straub's ghost story came out. And I read what the critics said. They were like, oh, this thing is terrifying. All of them said that. In fact, one critic said it's so scary that he was midway through it. His wife tapped him on the shoulder and said it was time for dinner. And he said, don't do that. Ah! I thought, all right. I was cynical. I said, okay, nothing's that scary. And I bought a copy of the book. And I was reading it, and just like Van Tilburg Clark in the Oxbow incident, the first half of that novel is all beautifully written, intriguing, but it's all about academics, this university and these characters. And I'm like, yeah, this is interesting, but where's all this terror going to come? And so, but I read through it and then you come to a part of midway through the novel where one character quietly says to another, found you. And that novel spirals down into one of the most terrifying ghost stories I've ever read. And every single scrap of information about characters and about later plot things, if I hadn't read it, it wouldn't have had the power. I would argue that same powerful effect in a different way comes with Van Tilburg Clark. Yes, I would say encourage people, if they're reading it for the first time, plow through what you may feel is not necessary, is minutia. It isn't. Every scrap will be useful.
Another question on the Oxbow incident. This book was made into an acclaimed movie in 1943, which was nominated for Best Picture that year. Do you think the movie itself packs as much of a punch as the book?
No. I am a huge Henry Fonda fan, Anthony Quinn. I like Dina Andrews as an actor too, but I was a huge fan of both of those men. And as the critics said, it is a well-acted film. I thought the screenplay captured a lot, but no, because I would recommend anyone who wants to do both. Read the book first, then watch the film. I believe the novel, as novels are wont to do, gives the reader an inside depth that is not possible to be seen just on the movie screen, in my opinion. So although it's an excellent film, and I would say watch it in conjunction, read the book first, and then it will be enriching.
I'm a film buff, so I would just like to point out to our viewers that if you do watch the Oxbow incident, the movie came out in '43. Note the beautifully done black and white cinematography, which really lends almost a film noir-like quality to the movie as you move through it. Okay, I can't let you go before I ask you this one and a couple of others, but this one really relating to one book. As a past one book instructor, I know you taught several of our one book titles. What is the ongoing value you see in the One Book Annual Reading Initiative, both for individuals and for the city of Chicago?
Oh, I love the whole concept of One Book, One Chicago when it came out. And I loved the effect. What do I think its value? Why do I love it? Because it became a wonderful social equalizer. I saw people carrying the sacks that had the books on the bus. I saw them on L. People were talking about these books, starting with To Kill a Mockingbird, the first one, and on through. Not just the graduate course I taught at DePaul about the One Book, One Chicago. I mean, beyond. I saw people talking about these books in little clusters sometimes. When you'd in the oddest places, you'd be on, like I said, on the L, and somebody might pass the library and be talking about them. It created more people went into, I would argue, I don't know this definitively, but I would guess it brought more people into our libraries, our bookstores. the museums, the places that brought people together for the discussion groups. It created a nice social leveler in the sense that you didn't have to have like a college degree to study and to read these and enjoy them and discuss them. And those who did, that was equally fine. It brought people of all ilks, ages, and ideals and ideas together in a unified discussion of some powerful storytelling.
Well, Joyce, I think that's the most beautiful recommendation for one book I've ever heard. And I thank you for that on behalf of all of us here at the library. We may call on you again for that, for something like that. Okay, I think we're going to veer a little bit away from the Oxbow right now, because you're so inspiring to listen to. I think now I'd like to ask you, can you share with us some of the titles of your favorite books and why you would encourage us to read them? I think everybody might like to know that.
Well, thank you. Like yourself, I'm a bibliophile. I love reading, have from early on. Okay, this is not just because it was the first selection at the One Book, One Chicago, but one of my all-time favorite books is To Kill a Mockingbird. Harper Lee's novel, to me, is universal. I have read, and I was kind of hurt to read this, that there is a bit of a discussion into that recently that perhaps it shows the character of Atticus Finch as some kind of like white knight that leading the Black people to clarity. No, I'm sorry. I didn't live in the 1930s South, but my parents did. And they both said that the power, and they were the ones who first bought the novel. We had a nice, well-stocked home library when I was growing up. My parents were both very avid and eclectic readers. And that was where the book was on the shelf. And I said, Mom, should I read this? And she said, oh yeah, Dad and I read it, you'll like it. And then when I talked to she and Dad about it, they said, no, Atticus Finch was a character that his time, he was doing what he did to great courage, and to have had any other way of presenting him would have been false. And so other than that small criticism, I've really not heard too much against To Kill a Mockingbird. I only bring that in because the slight controversy, because I just wanted to put my spin on it, but it's so powerful. The childhood, it doesn't matter, the Scout Jim in Halloween costumes and Boo Radley, there's always someone in your neighborhood that you're like, we're afraid of. You know, that house, you can't go by it. A witch lives there, a warlock lives there. I mean, it's childhood incorporated with a deeper, heartfelt sense. So that's one of my favorites. Toni Morrison's Beloved combines for me the best of all things. A brilliant writer, wonderful descriptions. The ghost baby's hands were full of baby spite. I mean, Morrison brings the horrors of slavery and the echoes, the reverberations of it in a ghost story of a mother who would sacrifice her child rather than have her go back into what she felt was the ultimate hell on earth, slavery. I mean, it's a powerful read, but it is, it's Toni Morrison on that. I guess one of my thirds, I never would have thought my daughter, when she was in junior high school age, introduced me to what would later become one of my favorite books. I'm not a big mystery fan reader usually, but one spring I had a very bad cold and I was home, and my daughter had gone to she liked to go to little like the rummage sales and things with her friends. And there for 10 cents, she bought me a copy of Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. And she said, Mom, I heard that the ladies there that sold it said this is a good book. I wanted to buy you something to help you pass the time while you're recovering from your cold. And I said, oh, thanks, honey. You know, the condescending, oh, isn't that sweet? I don't like mysteries. But I had always heard the famous opening line, you know, I jumped last night, we returned to Mandalay, and how highly is praised. So out of respect to my daughter, I said, well, I'll start it, you know, so I can tell her I did truthfully. Was I humbled? The kid knew what she was talking about. That Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca has become one of my all-time favorite novels. And it wasn't until I was almost 9/10 of the way through the book that I realized that du Maurier brilliantly, you never had the first name of the main character. She's always the second Mrs. De Winter. I thought, it's just so powerful. Rebecca, unless now that I think on it, the character's parents had actually named her the second Mrs. De Winter, and that's on her birth certificate. I'll have to look into that. But that, and then when you add into that, I guess not final, but I love The House on Mango Street. Oh, by Sandra Cisneros. Her descriptions, of her life with her family, her mom's hair, she once said was described like small curls of circles of candy. Oh, and when she describes, Cisneros in description, riding a bike, I remember being 12 years old and speeding through the neighborhood on my bike. And then there's a lot of profundity in there along with warm memories.
I'd like to point out that's another One Book, One Chicago past selection too.
That's right. I'd forgotten for a moment. Yes, forgive me. Yes. Then the final would be, I love short stories, ghost stories, M.R. James, poetry. Mark Turcotte, Native American writer, his poem Battlefield, all of his works, but that's one of the most profound poems that I've ever read. And then I guess I'd have to add my last for this. I could go on and on, but J. Alfred Prufrock. Oh, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The first, oh my gosh. I just love that poem. My favorite undergrad professor, Dr. John Reese, used to quote constantly in class, "I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas." And when I finally when I was taught Prufrock, T.S. Eliot, that poem is just profound. It is poetry. And then I guess the one that really, a poem I read when I want to take a brief vacation is William Butler Yeats's The Isle of Innisfree. It's a short poem. For those who have not read it, I recommend it. If you have, you know what I mean. But by the time I finished reading about the island with the small Isle of Innisfree with the water lapping to the edges and the bees in the background, I find myself relaxing. And when he ends it, back in the city streets like we all are plunged in it, and yet in the deep heart's core, as the poet puts it, I have this. I understand that's the real power of literature. But don't get me started. I could keep you here for 5 hours, Craig, talking about books I love. So I'm going to leave it there on those.
Well, maybe I'll have you back and we can talk for more about it, Joyce, because I think we could listen to you all day. I think I'd like to conclude my questions. Tell us a bit about your current activities, and are there any upcoming opportunities for people to experience your storytelling or writing skills?
I'm still very much involved in teaching storytelling and writing. First, I most recently ended a wonderful venture. I was proud to be, I was asked to facilitate writing workshops for Native American writers who were trying to get their work more broadly read and seen. This was done through the Indigenous Lecture and Writing Series, and it was done as a series of workshops and speakers between Northwestern University in Evanston and the University of Illinois at Chicago. Wow, I loved it. The talent that's out there, and I was honored to be able to help put my help in helping these writers develop. So I still do things of this nature. My storytelling is constant and eclectic. In fact, at the 30th of this month, I'm going to be doing a storytelling at for my daughter works. I've done it at the Mitchell Museum. I do all over the place. But my major project right now, and I'm thrilled to talk briefly about it, is I'm writing my first book of ghost stories. Now, I've been a freelance writer for many years. I was a freelance journalist when our children were small. I've published articles and things of this nature, but all nonfiction. This is my first foray into my beloved genre of ghost stories. I'm halfway through. I'm writing, yes, this is done purposely, 13 tales, original ghost stories, multicultural ghost stories. I've given it the title Midnight Coffee, and I intend hopefully to have it completed by, yes, done purposely, Halloween of this year. So I will keep anyone interested, and thank you for the interest, posted on how that develops. And those are really what are really keeping me busy and occupied these days.
Wow, well, that's quite a bit, Joyce. Do you have a website or any place people can visit to keep up with you?
Not yet, thank you. I'm planning, funny you should mention that. I'm planning to develop one, but as soon as I do, Craig, I'll let you know. And if anybody would be interested, I'd be thrilled to have that interest.
Oh, that's great. I could help with that when you get that finished.
Oh,
yeah. Well,
thank you.
Joyce, I can't tell you what a joy it's been. Thank you so much. for providing this fascinating talk and discussion. As we close out this program, please know that those listening can access information about One Book, One Chicago from the Chicago Public Library website at chicagopubliclibrary.org, where they can find a lot of information about all of the many resources the Chicago Public Library system has to offer, the many programs we offer from childhood through 150 years old. We have programs to please everyone, from kids to adults. Joyce, thanks. That concludes today's program celebrating the 20th anniversary of the One Book, One Chicago initiative with this really great look back at the Oxbow incident by Walter Van Tilburg Clark. Again, a very special thanks to our friend Joyce Miller Bean, to our technical and marketing departments, and to all of you for joining us. We hope to see you again online and in person soon once we get through our current situation in the city. So thanks to all again, and take care to everyone. Bye all.
Thank you.